Thank you for joining us for our African Book Club series. My name is Nia McAllister, and I'm the Senior Public Programs Manager at MoAD. And we are really excited to be discussing the book Call and Response, Stories by Gothataone Moeng. And thank you all for being participants today. We are really fortunate to have our author joining us for a live conversation with Faith. So the first portion of today's program will be Gothataone in conversation with Faith, and then we'll open it up for audience Q&A and group dialogue to get into this. So I'm going to pass it off to Faith to add a little context before we have our author join us.
Oh, okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. The few and the proud regulars, really excited to see you here. And I just lost my page. Wait a minute, what's going on? So, yeah, so this is super exciting. I assume we've all read the book. Beautiful collection of 9 short stories. I'm not sure if we've read from Botswana before. I don't think so. I mean, it's a small country, and I don't think there's a terrible amount of, a lot of literature coming out. So this is exciting. And it's also interesting that she was, that she sets a lot of the stories in the 2 places where she grew up, the village, and then she moved to go to boarding school in Gaborone in the capital. And so those are the 2 settings. And then I guess came to the US to do her MFA and has received a lot of success here with like fellowship after fellowship. About 2/3 of the stories were already published in American literary journals before the collection came out. So she's a relatively recent, arrival here. So it'll be really interesting to see her perspective around this. And then I understand that she was also back in the village during the pandemic, and that the opening story is kind of set there and kind of deals with that returning with that outsider's view to going back home and seeing what life is like. I don't have a lot of context. Botswana is this tiny, tiny landlocked country down,
tiny, not tiny, it's pretty big.
Well, okay, but in terms of people, it's like, only 2 million people. But yeah, a lot of space and geographically really interesting, 3 big regions, but yeah, a tiny in terms of people. So yeah, I just really interested to start talking to her since she's here already. Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Welcome.
Thank you.
I'm Faith.
Oh, hello. Hi. How are you? Oh, I probably should put my laptop on some books or something.
Yeah. And thanks for staying up late with us. We appreciate it. We are recording for our YouTube channel for folks who can't make it. So,
Okay.
hopefully many more other people get to see our conversation as well. So I'd love it if you could get started with the reading. And then we can have a conversation about your beautiful book.
Okay. So you said I should read from A Good Girl. All right, so this is from A Good Girl. All this was years ago, 3 years, in fact, before Botswana gave in to the seduction of the Johannesburg we watched on the soapies and moved there all by herself. 7 years before Papa died from a cancer of the stomach. 9 years before I was admitted to UB and bade farewell to my mother to join my brother in Gaborone. I thought often of that house of my sister's dreams in the peripatetic years of my life in the city. Years filled with roommates, Christian girls who went to open-air services during weekends and returned clutching bottles of holy water, buoyed by the prospect of miracles. Girls who split their student allowances to pay rent and to send money back home. girls who guilted me into buying MoA, Golden, Herbalife, secondhand dresses arriving in bales from the UK and China. All over Gaborone, I lived with a series of these girls. 4 years in the dorms at UB, where I studied humanities, which all the science and finance students called Luhuma, for the inevitable poverty that awaited those of us studying English and African literature and theology. After Tlokweng, White City, Mogodisane, Block 5, sharing 7 quarters and 2.5s, leaving every time the lease lapsed and the rent was hiked. The only evidence of our lives together was the portraits of these girls that I sketched into my notebooks. My roommates and I, we ran out of food and out of money to buy more. We watched pirated movies on our laptops, love stories and romantic comedies. We wanted love and to be literate in love. We wished to fall in love with the men we watched in the movies. We wanted heartbreak, but only enough that our hearts required no worse cure than languishing in bed with a tub of ice cream. Some of the men we knew told us, "Lorato, logaswa nka hoja," and we were afraid that they would love us to our deaths, and that even in our deaths, they would consume us. Some of the men we knew declared their love to us in English, the language of deception, a second skin they donned and shared as they wished. We fell in love with these guys, swept up in the slipperiness of their words, their declarations. We were in love. We thought we were in love. We felt sure it was love this time. We made love after making them wait for months. We had sex with 1, 2, 3 guys in a year, hustling out pussy to convince them we were marriageable. We abstained from sex for 6 months at a time, for twice that, convinced it made us better, virtuous women. We fucked 3, 5, 7 guys in one night, in 1 month. Our bodies were rapacious and unashamed. We fucked them on the same alcohol-fueled, laughter-drenched nights we had met them at a bar. We abstained, fearing disease. We wanted love. Oh, we wanted love. But we knew we had been warned that for girls like us, love was dangerous, a bright burning flame. It would lick us alive.
That's great. Thank you so much. I love that. It reminds me a bit of who is that guy? The Nigerian guy who wrote the story was Miracle. It won the Cane
Oh, I know
Prize.
what you're talking about.
Yeah.
No, what is his name?
It's
I know
just-
what you're talking about.
you know,
But I forgot his name, but he wrote that book, A Particular Kind of Black Man.
a particular kind of black man. Yeah.
Yes,
He
yeah.
uses the we as well for like the collective desire. But he's talking about, I think, he's talking about Nigerian communities in the US, and you have it with this group of girls, which I really resonated with. So I really love that. And it's very hypnotic, of their desires, which is really great. I mean, one of the things that's so exciting about this collection is the use of language that a lot of reviewers have remarked on. I definitely felt it here as well. We have all these wonderful kind of idiomatic expressions and phrases, as well as just all of these, the details. I'm like, oh yes, I remember that thing, and detrol, and just like all of the just the details of African life are just so evocative. And I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit about how you kind of approach language, and the oral tradition, perhaps, which the title, I think, maybe references.
Yeah. Oh, wow. That's a tough question. I guess it's always a little bit tough for me when I'm thinking about language, because I'm obviously writing about characters who exist with, and speak, and live within it, a language other than English. Like my characters speak Setswana, they live in Botswana, they talk to each other in Setswana. Although, of course, some of the younger characters speak to each other in English, but most of the characters speak in Setswana. And so I always have like when I have to think about dialogue in particular, I have to really think very carefully about how do I get the dialogue to sort of reflect the way that a person would speak in Botswana, but it's still in English and it doesn't sound, but like that I don't translate it directly in a way that it sounds nonsensical, like it doesn't make any sense. So that's something that I think a lot about trying to sort of get to the meaning of a sentence, but also the meaning of a particular speech pattern or like a particular line of dialogue, but not um translating it so directly that it doesn't make any sense in English. Like in English, it doesn't sound like a person is making any sense.
Yeah.
And then also because I write, like some of the characters speak Setswana, I have to think about, like, there's certain things that are untranslatable from Setswana to the English language. So I have to always think about, and I have had readers say this to me, like, oh, it's so annoying, it's so tiresome when you're reading, and then there's like a sentence in a language I don't understand, it's just like, it doesn't, like it sort of closes me out as a reader. I have had people say that to me. I've had actually somebody that I gave the manuscript to as, she was like an editor. I needed her to help me out with some historical details for the longer story, the early education and she was a historian, and she's like an English literature teacher, but I think she's like she's an editor, and so I was like, I'm very curious about whether you could help me with making sure that I'm including historical details in this story without being too didactic with things like that. And she was just like, it's a little bit annoying when I have to read a sentence in it's on a language which I don't understand. And I think it might exclude some readers and things like that. And so I have to also think about how do I navigate those sort of situations where there might be like a phrase that is not translatable to English that I would like to use because it would be a phrase that is apt in a particular situation or a particular context that the characters would use in a particular context, but that I can't necessarily translate into English. Like if I was to translate into English, then it would lose the meaning or like the texture that it would give to the story. So like those sort of things, I have to think about those sort of things. Yeah, I think those are some of the things that I think about when I'm thinking about using language. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm really shocked because I thought at this point, where we're reading so much African literature as well as international literature, that at this point people were more sophisticated about the idea of code switching and not making everything so translatable. So I'm shocked that happened. It's very disappointing. Interesting. If you're thinking about Setswana, what is like the grammar or the structure of Setswana that like might be useful for us to know when we're reading something? Like when I read Nigerian English, I can tell what language I'm coming from, right? So is there something that makes it particularly Setswanan in terms of structure or syntax, or just using like colorful adages and idioms? Or
Yeah, that's a very good question, actually. I think this is actually one other thing that I feel a little bit disadvantaged about. I think that writers from Nigeria and from Ghana and from like West Africa in particular have definitely created their own sort of version of English that is very distinctive, that when you see it, you're like, this is Nigerian, this is Ghanaian, I understand this. And they can keep that pigeon, but you can still understand the meaning of the sentence. Whereas, and I think South Africans also to some extent. Whereas Botswana, I think that we use very proper, I actually think we use very proper English. And so like our English, so like the only way that our English could be distinctive from like British English, which is, we were colonized by the British, is that there are certain ways that we have this term where we say we are analyzing English, which is that you take um a Setswana word and you just like use it as an English word. Like or we have these ways of using both languages in the same sentence, things like that. But in terms of Setswana, I think that now it's so informed by the way that younger people speak. It's so informed by global influences, by social media, by TikTok, by Twitter, things like that. And so, younger people, when they talk, sometimes you're just like, oh, that's like a slang word from the UK, or that's a slang word that's like that's a slang word that they're getting from hip hop music.
Yeah.
But it's actually like a very complicated language. Like this Setswana language is very difficult. For me, it's like really difficult to translate. Like I have a lot of trouble really translating it when I try to translate my character's dialogue from Setswana to English. I find it really difficult because it's a language that it's I don't know if the right word is like obscure, we like to obscure meaning by just like using a lot of proverbs, and just not being very straightforward, like, not being like very direct in speech, but just like couching meaning in like a lot of proverbs. Like when you speak to elderly people, sometimes you're just like, I have no idea what you just said. Just because they're using so many proverbs that you're just like, I don't know what you just said. Like, can you explain to me what you mean? So it's very difficult for me to kind of figure out how to translate the language. But also I'm not a linguist, so I think that's also probably part of the reason. It's like I'm not a linguist. I'm not I also didn't study the Setswana language in school. Like the last time I studied Setswana was when I was 13 years old in secondary school. I opted to study French because I thought it was really cool. Now I'm always like having trouble figuring out how to say certain things in Setswana. So
That's funny. So what about I mean, that's really interesting. And yeah, I think I definitely relate to the obscuring meaning, particularly with the elders and the proverbs. And you're like, what? But what about then your literary education? Like, I know you did your MFA in the US, but when you were writing back home in Botswana, like, or I'm not that familiar with, any literature out of Botswana. Like, who are you in conversation with? Who were you studying to just think about how you were going to write?
Bessie Head is
Okay.
the writer that I think has been like the greatest influence for me. She was a South African writer who moved to Botswana during apartheid, and she actually lived in Sarowe, not very far from where I am actually. And she wrote all of her books well, not all of them, but most of her books were set in Sarowe, and she wrote about people here, and she
Mm.
very much wrote about ordinary people in the village. So I think my work is very much in conversation with her work because I think we're both interested in just like the lives of ordinary people and the lives of ordinary people in the village, like rural lives. Um, and so I think she's like the one that was the most influential to me. There are other writers in Botswana that have published books, either in South Africa or here within Botswana.
Mm.
So writers like Wami Molefe has been a great influence for me. Lori Kubitila has also been a great influence for me. Unity Dao, all of these like Botswana writers that have published mostly, I think, with South African publishers. So they haven't had like an international reception, if that's like the right way to put it. Yeah.
Right. Okay, great. That's really helpful. Thank you for sharing that. And hopefully we can get some of those titles. There's that whole thing too of right who is read internationally, who can
Yeah.
we have
Yeah.
access. And so
Nia, Nia, could you put those names in the chat for us?
Sure.
Thank you.
Nia's always good on that. So great. Yeah, so I'm glad that you did bring up Bessie Head because she's in the epigraph, and I love it when people pay homage to our literary forebears and foremothers. And I think that I was noted that like you dedicate the book to your mother and your grandmother. You've got the epigraph by Bessie and also by Annie Arnaud. And the focus, most of our characters are women and girls in both the village and in the capital. So just really interested in how is that just natural for you, the focus on gender? Um, are you is that part of kind of focusing on ordinary people, like people who maybe aren't always the literary heroes or the centers of kind of stories? Was that a kind of a conscious thing, or is it just kind of moving out of your, your life and kind of being surrounded? Are you hearing stories from your mother and grandmother, or how did gender come into playing such a strong role with these great characters in the book?
Yeah, I think it just comes out of my life. You
Mhm.
know, a couple months ago, I had to do this talk. It was for a job. I didn't get the job, but it was it was a talk that asked me that the prompt for the talk was like, why does fiction matter?
Oh,
And I had like yeah, I know. So it was like, what the hell? I don't even know how to answer this question. So I had to make something up quick. But I kind of was like thinking about what was it that made me like what was my earliest sort of interest um in stories, or
yeah.
what stories was I being told when I was younger? You
Mm.
know, I do you know, earlier you mentioned like an oral culture, and I think um I do remember that my grandmother telling us stories when I was younger, but it wasn't like a very dominant part of my childhood. I don't remember it as a very dominant part of my childhood. I do remember that we would read folk tales in books, like they would be written down, folk tales would be written down. But then there would be some that my grandmother would tell us, and some oh, what do you call these riddles, like these so like we would have riddles where they would say like a phrase and you had to guess what the thing is, like what the phrase is like describing, like that kind of thing was like what I remember as some of what we were taught as part of our, you know, like sort of storytelling. But then when I think more about where did actually these stories come from, for me, I think it was just like me and my cousins when we were younger. I come from a very big extended family. We would play houses. You know, like we'd go away somewhere to go and play houses and play like you're the mom, you're the dad, you're the neighbor, you're the church minister, whoever. And we would come up with all of these stories that we're obviously taking from, you know, from our families. Like we're taking them from our families and going to enact them up, you know, would play, go up on the hill to play. And we're sort of taking these stories and sort of making up these situations with all of this conflict, and like learning like, oh, maybe this neighbor's chickens ate my spinach, and somebody, you know, like I'm coming to confront you because your chickens ate my spinach or whatever. And then somebody has to come in and like mediate. And it was like, oh my God, we're learning how to be how to be like men and women, how to be like members of our community, members of our culture, because this is exactly what happens in the village. Like this is what happens with our mothers and with our aunts and everybody, with our neighbors. But now we're sort of enacting that. And I think that, you know, that for me was, now that when I'm looking back, I'm like, oh, that's the thing that sort of sparked the interest in like ordinary sort
Mm.
of in ordinary people and just like smaller conflicts and things like that. Because when I first started writing, um, when I was very young, when I was like 13 years old, and I was like, I'm gonna write a novel. When I was 13, I was reading a lot of Enid Blyton. I don't know, like a lot of Americans don't know this British children's writer, but I think everybody who grew up in like the Commonwealth,
Yes, yes.
in like you know, in the countries that were colonized by the British, all have know this lady and all have read her work.
Yeah.
And I was a very big fan of her books, very big fan of her famous five series. And when I first started trying to write, I was writing exactly the way that any Blyton would be writing, you know. So I just remember distinctly that I had a character who had like curly hair and had like freckles. And I was just like, now when I think about it, I'm like, was this character black or white? I don't know. So was it I don't know. She was like racially ambiguous. I don't know. But she had like freckles. She had curly. I mean, that could be a Black character, but I didn't know any people with like freckles back then. So so at first I was like, this is that's how I was writing. And then when I started reading Bessie Head, that's when I was like, oh, I can literally just like write about people in my life.
Right.
And so I think that's what the interest in ordinary people kind of stemmed from reading Bessie Head, but also sort of thinking about those stories, like, oh yeah, this is what we used to do. And sort of thinking about just like the small tensions that can accrue between people that live in the same place. The sort of small tensions that can accrue between family members, that, you know, can be very small, but also mask these like larger rifts, you know. And I think when it comes to sort of writing about women, um, I think it's both just like the unfortunate fact that, um, you know, for some of us in our families, like we have men, but they're just like not like they just like don't participate in the lives of the family. So we just like really don't see them that much. So like I don't really know them that much. You know, like I know the women, like I know what the women are about. I know what the women are interested in. The men, they come and go, they sort of, so I think maybe that's part of it. But also I think it was sort of an interest in not to sound really narcissistic, but it was like an interest in myself and an interest in my own thoughts and ideas and like who am I and how different am I from other people. And you know, like if I'm thinking these particular thoughts that might not be very nice and kind about people, what are they thinking about me? Like that. So it's sort of an interest in just like myself as a person, as a girl, as a woman, and sort of thinking about like, oh, what about my mother? How was she like when she was 18 years old or when she was 25 or whatever? And so more of an interest in like women because I spend so much time around women in my family. But also just like an interest in myself and like putting myself in relation to other people and in particular in relation to other women.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Yeah. And that makes sense too. I mean, if you're centered on kind of domestic drama and yeah, and the
Yeah.
transmission of cultural values and all of that, thinking about the community and the family, it would really make sense that women would be really strong actors in that. Um, and I mean, I think your stories are really kind of tapping into kind of classic themes from the time that, you know, Africans started writing in these Western forms, which is this, you know, tension between tradition and modernity, you know, what is lost when you modernize or, you know, kind of take these things on of modern life and kind of turn away from customs. And it's illustrated so beautifully in a number of these stories. I think Small Wonders in particular, but in all of them, kind of this longing for both tradition and modernity, and how does that get worked out on an individual level. Um, I read in one of the reviews that the short story form seems to be perfect for your subject matter, particularly if you're thinking about kind of ordinary life and mundanity, that the short story form lends itself to that. And I don't know if you agree with that, or why do you feel drawn to that form? Um, and are you exploring other forms as well, or what does the short story allow you to do?
Oh my God. What does the short story allow me to do? I honestly think it allows me to do as much as a novelist would do, but it allows me to do that in a shorter space of time. Um, I think, you know, I think that when I first started writing, I was drawn to short stories for a very practical reason, which is that I'm trying to teach myself how to write. And so it felt like it feels natural for me to try something smaller, something sort of manageable that I can finish within, that I could maybe like finish within like a week, you know. I would think I'm gonna finish a draft in a week, or like maybe I'm gonna sit down and finish a draft in a day. And so I think when I first started writing, that's what I was hoping for. I was sort of teaching myself how to write, and the short story felt like a manageable form, a much more manageable form than the novel. But as I've grown as a writer and as a reader, I think that short stories can hold, for me, short stories feel very capacious, actually. I feel like they can hold as much as a novel can, but they can do so in a shorter space of time. And since I'm sort of interested in time and in how time kind of works on your life and works on a person, works on a character, and how it like how a person's development from one age to another age. And I think the short story allows me to sort of deal with time in an interesting way. Like if I'm thinking about a story like even A Good Girl,
Yeah.
right? The first part of it, the first 10 pages all happen within, I think it's a day or 2 days. And then there's that little section in between that's just like, that just shows like the passage of time. Like so much time has passed that now this girl who was like 9, I think, in the beginning is now going off to college. And so sometimes I'm just like, if I was writing a novel, what would I have put in those sections when she's like 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15? You know what I mean? I don't know. I feel like I'm not answering the question. For me, the short story is just as capacious as a novel. I think something that I like about the short story, I think that me personally, I'm temperamentally more suited for the short story, just because I feel like the novel is so extroverted, such an extroverted form. Like it takes up so much space, and like culturally, even just like how much space it takes, how much like the volume of the novel is so big. But even just like culturally, it's like such a big, important form, that to me that feels very intimidating. Whereas the short story, I think, is unassuming, it's humble, I think. It's sort of kind of inward looking, but it's not, it holds a lot of depth and a lot of meaning. So you can have like a short story that's like 2 pages long and has like a lot of depth. So I think when I think of the novel, I'm thinking like the novel sort of moves in this way, like you're moving forward, whereas the short story, I think of it as like moving sort of downwards, like it's holding so much meaning and so much substance, so much depth that I think for me, I'm just like not that extroverted kind of a person. I'm not, and I don't think that my stories either are like extroverted. I think that very sort of quiet, unassuming stories about very small situations. And I do think that I think that they are more suited to the short story, I think. But I am actually working on a novel right now, and I'm having a lot of trouble with it just because I'm just like, oh my God, how do I move from, I'm even having trouble with like, how do I move from one chapter to another? Like if this chapter finishes this way, how does the next one begin? It's just so bewildering to me. That, you know, it's very challenging, but I'm determined to finish it. So we'll see how it goes. We'll see how it
There's
goes.
always the story, what is it, the novel in stories, right? The link story.
Yeah,
Like a novel.
yeah. I guess I could do that. I could do that, but I don't feel like it's trying to become a novel in stories. I just feel like it's a novel that is sort of moving in very like lots of different directions. And at this point, I'm just like, I'm just gonna write whatever I'm thinking, and then I will figure it out
Yes.
afterwards. It's really tough.
Well, I'm a strong believer in that the story will tell you what structure it wants. Like each story knows what it wants, right? Doesn't want to be a poem, doesn't
Yeah.
want to be a short story, doesn't want to be a novel, so we just kind of listen to it and figure it out. But I love the fact that you're not, hopefully not feeling the pressure to do the novel, this whole idea that, a story is a training ground, but if once you grow up, you have to write a novel. I think that's not true. I think there are people, who, stories are perfect for them and I did feel that we were entering entire worlds that were completely fleshed out and fully realized within each one of your stories. Which
Thank you.
I mean, it was completely satisfying. Um, and I'm wondering about just the process of putting together a collection, because I know it's not all the stories you wrote. So how did you decide on these particular 9 stories and in the way that they were organized and then under the idea of call and response?
Yeah, so when I started writing, I wasn't really thinking that I was writing a book. When I started writing these stories, I was sort of just like working on individual stories,
Mhm.
and um, you know, at some point I was just like, oh my God, they're all sound the same. They're all like about the same thing. So I think at some point I did realize that they were sort of preoccupied with the same questions and the same themes, the same sort of tensions that you mentioned earlier, like the modernity and tradition and the city and the village and the past and the present and all those things. And so yeah, there's some stories that I wrote and some of them that I published in other journals before this that are not in the collection. And I think I eventually just chose the stories that kind of were working with the themes that sort of were resonated, like the themes are sort of resonating across the stories. And the call and response, the title, one of the stories was titled Call and Response initially. It's a story called Dark Matter. It was initially called Call and Response. And then when I was reading it and I was like revising it, I thought maybe it felt a little heavy-handed to have that title for that story because it has like 2 timelines. And it's very interested in how the past is sort of exerting pressure on this character's present. And so it felt very much like, oh my God, maybe it's like too much. It feels too heavy-handed to have that title. But I really liked the title and I thought that the title felt really apt. And that it kind of contained the idea that the book is sort of the ideas that this book is concerned with, these ideas of like the push and pull between the past and the present, between modernity and tradition, between like family obligations and community obligations versus like an individual's desire for their own autonomy. So it was like just like these tensions that the stories are exploring. It felt like they were very well represented by the idea of call and response. So it actually has nothing to do with like the musical, like music is just like these 2 things just like pulling back and forth. But in that story, Dark Matter, the phrase call and response does it is present in that story because there's a moment in which the character is walking around San Francisco, actually. I don't think it's named, but it is San Francisco. She's walking around San Francisco and then she hears somebody calling her name and she, like I think the sentence is something like the only response is to go home or something like that. So the idea call and response exists in some way within that particular story, but the reason why I chose it as a title was because of the way that the ideas, those themes, those concerns that resonate across all the stories. How did I honestly, when it comes to the arrangement of the stories, I worked with my editor and with my agent, because I just didn't know um how to arrange the stories. I was more concerned with like with what story would go first. And I think, we chose Botswana, which is Botswana is the name of the ward that I live in, like where I am right now. And I think that story to me, it felt like that should definitely be the first story in the book because it introduces the world of the book, really. It introduces like the ward, Botswana, the ward, and introduces the village of Sorowe. And I think, introduces the community, introduces the country and the Gaborone, that's a city. And I think it also, in that particular story, there's the concerns, like the sort of ideas that are that I'm exploring in that story are ideas that I explore in all of the other stories, in most of the other stories, which are, about this young girl who's like yearning for something more in her life and who has to like deal with these family obligations versus her own desires, and who's also just like, dealing with like a first love.
Yeah.
And a lot of the women in the in the book, not a lot, but maybe some of the women in the book, are interested in love and in romance. And so I think those sort of ideas sort of carry on to the other stories in the book as well.
Yeah, yeah. And there's that past present thing too, because there's
Yes.
like what her mother and her Aunt Lydia represented, like
Yes.
that possibility of that glamorous life, and then there's the reality of the patient now too. So yeah, there's so many
Yeah.
interesting push-pull tensions in that story at the beginning. For such a quiet story, it's really masterful. So that's great. Yeah, it's always interesting to see what's the opening story to kind of set the tone. I think that's
Yeah.
really chosen. Do other people have questions? I have dominated. I have monopolized your time, and I'm sure other people have questions. Yeah, Ole.
Yeah, first of all, I want to thank you for coming to talk to us. I really enjoyed your book.
Thank
And,
you.
and I have a question about your longest story, Early Life and Education, about the character of Laraco. Why is it that you had him stay with his grandmother after his mother got remarried or got married, and then he moved to his uncle's house, and apparently he never lived with his mother? And I was wondering why you made that decision.
Okay. Well, traditionally, that is a real possibility that happens to a lot of people. When a woman has had a child before marriage, when they get married, the husband, sometimes they'll ask the husband, like, are you gonna take the child with you? Like, it's essentially like, are you adopting the child? And the man has the option of saying yes or no. And if they say no, then the child cannot go to the new home that the mother is in. And so this is what happened with Lerato in this particular story. But I think I don't with Lerato too, I wanted to explore I think the story deals so much with throughout his life, he deals with this abandonment by what he sees as abandonment by his mother. I mean, it is an abandonment by his mother, but traditionally would just be considered sort of like it's a perfectly normal part of life. I don't think it happens so much anymore, but it used to happen a lot in the past. Like you could, like the husband could choose not to take the child with them, and they would have to be raised by other people. And so in Lerako's situation, he's raised by his grandmother, and then when his grandmother dies, he's raised by his uncle until he grows up. And so he no longer belongs to the mother, essentially. I think one of the things that I was interested in with that story was sort of exploring this question of religion, the traditional religious idea that, when your elders die, that sort of they become like ancestors for you, and they become these like guides for you. Like they don't abandon you through death, that they're still sort of looking after you or looking over you and sort of guiding your life, and then you have to sort of venerate them in some ways. And with Lerato, I was interested in a character whose education would really raise questions about his traditional beliefs or like his childhood beliefs. So, he's raised in this family that is he and his grandmother are pretty religious, and the uncle is also religious. So he's raised in like a Christian family. But, even when you're raised in a Christian family, these ideas about traditional religious beliefs are sort of just like there, just because that's sort of just part of your life. And I was interested in how somebody who is like that, who was a very devout Christian and later loses that Christian faith, and then later is confronted with this idea that maybe your uncle and your grandmother are still sort of looking over you. Somebody who's educated, who doesn't really place much stock and faith, like how he would react to that idea that maybe this traditional idea that your grandmother's still looking after you, like how would he react to that when he's sort of trying to be a very rational person who doesn't believe in this religion, faith, and all of those things. I don't know. I feel like I'm rambling. I hope I answered your question.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I also was curious about that same story just because of the length of it and the choice to break it up in kind of the numbered sections. I'm curious if you could just talk a little bit more about those decisions of structuring that specific story and the process of writing that one in relationship to the other stories.
Yeah. So so this is the story that has this, I think it's the only story that has a male protagonist. And one of the reasons why I was interested in having a male protagonist is because I actually wanted to write about the kettle post, which is in Botswana we have there's traditionally we have like a 3-home system. We have a home in the village, so we would have a home in Sorowe. I would have the lands where we grow, where you do like your agrarian farming kind of thing, and then you have the cattle post, which is where you keep your livestock, mostly your cattle. And traditionally, or historically, I should say, the cattle post is mostly like a male domain. Um, uh, the men are responsible for taking care of cattle and all of those things. And cattle mean very much to a Motswana man. They're really much more than like their wealth, but they're also like culturally, their wealth materially, but also like much more than that. Like they imbue a person with like a lot of status and respectability and all of those things. And so I was really interested in exploring the cattle post because I find it really fascinating because there is like a master servant relationship inherent to the cattle post, because somebody has to take care of your cattle, and is usually not all the time, but sometimes it is like people of different ethnic groups. So somebody who is from a more dominant ethnic group would have somebody of a minor ethnic group taking care of that cattle. And so these questions about the sort of master servant relationship that takes place in those spaces. So I wanted to think about those sort of questions with that story, and I knew that I would need a male character to sort of go into the cattle post in a very meaningful way, who maybe spend some time there, or like have to be responsible for the cattle post in some way. And then in as far as like the length of the story, I was interested in, it's really interesting because the story, when I first wrote it, it was like, I thought in my head, the first time I wrote a version of it that I submitted to a workshop, it was maybe like 27 pages, but it wasn't finished. And I was like, oh, I think this is going to be about 35 pages. It actually ended up being like 90 pages long. And I think I was really interested in like following a character from a young age to a much older age, and just like really watch how time kind of works against them and their lives and their beliefs, and the sort of different changes that are that they have to go through, any sort of social, cultural changes that will take place over that span of years. And in as far as like the structuring, it was just a way for me to think about the different stages of the character's life. It was like a way for me to sort of keep the story coherent and logical in my head, to just sort of like, here he's like 9 years old, and now he's 11, and now he's 13, and now he's 25, and now he's, he's at university, and now he's working, and now he's overseas. So it was like a way to sort of keep the different stages of his life coherent for myself in my head. But yeah, I think I was mostly just interested in like following a character throughout a very long span of life. And I was interested in writing about the cattle post.
Can you just repeat the ThreeHome System?
So there's the village,
Uh-huh.
which is where all of the social events happen, right? It's like the village is like, I was actually reading yesterday from a book by Bessie Hayden. She was like, the village is more like a place of rest, because that's where you come when the plowing season is over, and you're coming now to sort of relax and to attend all these weddings and all of these things. Obviously, it doesn't work like that anymore, because she was, she died, I think, in 1982, 1986, maybe. So things have changed, but the village is where I think now it's like where you live majority of the time. And where you have all of your funerals, your weddings, and all of these things. The farm, the land, we call it, in Botswana we call it the lands, when in English where we say the lands, but it's where you grow your sorghum and your beans and all of those things. And then the cattle post is where you keep your livestock, mostly your cattle.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so that's not accounting for then living in the capital, which like 10% of the population does, but
Yeah, now people live in the capital, but you would still have like a very strong attachment to your village. So you'd still like, in my family, people come to Saroe for all public holidays, like all holidays. They come home, like we don't go on vacation. We vacation at home.
right. Yes,
You
yes.
vacation in the village.
Right.
So yeah, people live in the cities and the towns because of work and all of those things, but they still have like a very strong attachment to their home villages.
Okay, okay. And then within the home villages, then you would have the land and the cattle, and then
No, the lands and the cattle posts are outside of the village.
okay. Okay.
But within the village, you would have different wards. You would have different wards. Like you'd have like different neighborhoods,
Mhm.
different wards according to, I think that's structured according to like families, and just like really like families and relatives live in the same ward. Yeah.
Interesting. Really interesting. So it seems that the setting is very important, both, I mean, just to life in Botswana, and I've only been to Gaborone, I've not been outside, and within the setting of the book itself, and that allows you to explore different aspects of your characters as they have different expectations or experiences in these different settings, more rural, more urban, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I think especially a lot of the women, they grew up in the village. And I should say that Saroe is actually a very big village, but it is um in like mood and I don't know, like I don't know, in mood and sensibility, it's very much a village. And like, I was just telling my friend today, I was just like, oh my God, since I've been here, I've been to so many funerals. Like and it's not like it's people that I know. It's just because my mom and my aunt want to go, and so I have to take them. And so I have to go to the funeral because it's just like you cannot go to a funeral. So like there's a very sort of um there's still that very traditional sensibility of like the certain ways that things need to be done. And for me, there's a very like I feel a very big difference between being in the village, being in Soroe where I am right now, and going to Gaborone. I think like the difference for me feels very stark, even though Gaborone is actually not that big of a city, but it's really not. It's not that big of a city, but when I'm here in the village, it just it's just like, oh, the expectations are just so heavy. It's I don't even know how to explain it. It's just I don't, but in sensibility and in mood, it's very much a village, even though it's very big, and we have like access to um modern amenities. We have access to like resources and stuff. I mean, the only thing that we don't have a cinema, we don't have a bookstore, but we have we have everything else. um but when I'm here, I still feel very much like, oh yeah, I'm very much in a village, and I'm home, and I can't just like wait. But I say that about Sorwe, but the smaller villages where you go, they will really dictate to you how you can dress and things like that. Like there's much greater sort of surveillance on you than there is in Sorwe. But when I'm here, I feel very much like, yeah, I'm very much in a village. But I think to go back to the stories, with the women, I think that I sort of think of them as like women who that interested in being good. I think they're dutiful, they're interested in being good, in the sense of like being a good girl, but then they have their own desires and their own ambitions. And I think when for them, the village is this place that doesn't allow them to sort of exercise their freedoms or to explore their ambitions or to explore their sort of individual desires and longings and stuff. And the city is what allows them to do those things. And so moving between the village and the city, like the city gives them the freedom to kind of explore what they want to do and explore their ambitions, their careers, their sexualities, their sex lives. Like they can do that in the city, because in the city you can be anonymous. You can't be that anonymous in the village, really, because the entire ward is like your relatives. If you don't greet somebody, then it's going to be like a big, like so and so, like she drove past me, she didn't stop for me, it's just like, oh my God. So in the village, like much greater freedom.
Yeah, yeah. That's so true. Oh, that's hilarious.
I have a question. I'm curious about, well, first of all, thank you for being here, and I loved your book and your stories, and I feel like I learned so much about humanity and about life in Botswana. I'm curious about, like, there doesn't seem to be a lot of class conflict outside of the cattle post. And I'm interested in like this whole ThreeHome system and people having cattle or having land. Like, is that pretty universal that people in Botswana, everybody has that, or are there different levels of like who has those kinds of resources and who doesn't? And one of the reasons why I ask is at MoAD, we featured an artist, Billy Zangewa, who now is in South Africa, but spent a lot of her childhood in Botswana. And she talked about it when she was at the museum as if it was this incredibly idyllic, like wonderful place where there was like no conflict among people in some ways. And I don't know if that's like childhood nostalgia looking back, or if you also feel that way about Botswana in comparison to other countries where you've been.
The ThreeHome system is not universal. So some people will have, like, the reason why somebody would be a headsman, would take care of somebody's cattle, is because they don't have cattle of their own. And traditionally, there were ways in which you could take care of somebody's cattle, and then they would give you, like, they would pay you in cattle so that you would accumulate your own livestock, your own herd of cattle as the years go by. But what is universal is that in Botswana, it's becoming much harder now, but before it used to be that you could, like you could just get land, like land was given out for free. So you would have like tribal land, which is that each ethnic community has land that belongs to them, and then if you are from that community, you could just get land for free. Technically you can still do that, but I've been on a waiting list for like 18 years. So it's like harder to get the land now. But it's not universal. It's like it's not universal. People especially I think where I am from in Sorowe, there is well, there was a history that like the royal people, all like cattle were taken care of by the San people. And then they were just like the relationship was literally like they were serfs. They were not being paid for it was, so that's how it was. Now people do pay people for their services of taking care of their cattle, but they're not paid that much money. Like sometimes people would pay them in food and stuff like that. So there is like a class distinction in Botswana. It's a very big class divide in Botswana. And like in the city, there is a big divide between people that live in the city and those that live in the villages. Like when I'm here, I'm always like very aware that people are very poor here. Like people don't have anything to eat. And Botswana is a middle income country. We're like one of the countries that is considered like a country that's like doing really well for its people, has like lots of social welfare programs, but there's still like a lot of poverty. So I think she's like thinking, it's interesting. I read a review many years ago. It was a review of Unity Dao's book, and it was like a South African magazine that was reviewing the book. And it said something like people that write about Botswana paint a very positive picture of Botswana. Like it must be a beautiful country because everybody paints a very beautiful picture of it. And I think it's that we have this narrative ourselves. We have like this mythology about ourselves as a country that we're like, oh, we're like such a peaceful country where we don't really experience any conflicts, or like we don't have experienced any wars or anything like that. It was like that during the colonial era, and when countries like South Africa and Zimbabwe and Namibia were in the middle of like the freedom movements, we were okay. We didn't have to have like a violent freedom, like a violent fight for independence. And I think we're still sort of continuing that myth that we're like this exceptional African country, but we're saying that because we're comparing ourselves to countries that are not doing very well. We're comparing ourselves to, like I don't want to mention Zimbabwe in a negative light, but I mean they have had economic sanctions now for I don't know how many years. Like they're not doing great at all. So we compare ourselves to Zimbabwe and we're like, well, good, because look at what's happening in Zimbabwe, look at what's happening in Zambia or Malawi or wherever. And that's how we think of ourselves as exceptional and an idyllic country, but we're really not. There's a lot of corruption here. We always come, like when these international bodies that I guess they assess or evaluate corruption in different countries, we always come out on top, like we're one of the least corrupt nations in the world or whatever. But we know that there's a lot of corruption here. And so we're very good at presenting a very positive picture to the world. We're really great at that. But internally, people are very unhappy.
Interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that. I look forward to reading more of your writing.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, thank you for staying on so long. We kept you longer than we promised we would, and I know it's late for you, but yeah, it's such a beautiful book, so beautifully written, and just so fun to dive into. That it was really a joy, and we're so happy that you were willing to come and spend time with us talking about it.
Oh, I think you were lost for a minute. I think my internet is like a little unstable right now.
Okay, sorry.
I
I
didn't
was,
hear,
yeah. No, I was just thanking you for staying so long with us and just
yeah, of
expressing
course.
again my joy in talking about such a beautiful, beautiful book. We're just really.
Thank you. Thank you. This was fun. This was fun. And I love this museum. I used to go there when I was living in San Francisco. I mean, I only lived there for about a year.
How would you get?
Yeah, I used to love coming to the Museum of African Diaspora. So
Oh,
this was really cool. It was really cool for me to do this with all of you guys.
that's
And thank you for inviting me.
that's so great. Yeah, we've had this book on our list ever since we saw the cover. Nia showed me the cover.
Oh.
We're reading that. Even before it came out, so it was really great. It's it's as vibrant and as exciting as the American cover indicated. The other
Mm,
covers are great as well. So it's terrific.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I think okay, yeah, wonderful. Great. So what's next for you? How can we keep up with what you're doing? And what should we be on the lookout for you?
Right now I am just really deep in this novel. I that's really what I'm devoting all of my time and all of my energy towards. And so hopefully it'll be out in a couple of years. And I'll let you guys know. Let you
Please.
guys know when it's out. Yeah. But
Yeah.
That's all I'm really focusing on right now. But I'm also hoping that since I'm home, I might be able to do research for other projects
Okay.
beyond the novel. So yeah, I'm happy to be here. I honestly am. And um it feels it's so weird because, you know, the first time I went to the US was 10 years ago.
Mm,
And I've been going back and forth between here and Botswana,
right.
between here and the US. And now that I'm home, sometimes it feels like I'm like seeing it for the first time. And it's
Mm.
interesting to say because it's also an election year. And I know it's an election year for you guys. I'm watching that election very closely. I'm like, am I I'm like, am I gonna go back to the US or no? I don't know.
Yeah, right.
I'm watching the election very closely. And it's an election year for us here too. So it's interesting. I haven't been back home in an election year in a long time. So it's interesting being here during an election year and just seeing oh my God, so stressful. But yeah. Hopefully I'll be able to do some more research for other projects while I'm here.
Yeah, that's cool. That's cool. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because you had so many yeah, you've had so many fellowships here. You've been outside a long time with
Yeah.
Stegner, Provincetown,
Yeah.
Madison. So yeah, it must be a little crazy to be back. But that's great. It's really exciting. Okay, cool. So is there anything more we need to do?
I just want to thank you again for coming and taking the time to spend with us. This has been really lovely to learn more about the book, to really dive into the stories in more depth. So thank you again for sharing this time with us. And it's so wonderful that you've been to MoAD in person. So I'm really glad we could connect and have this time together in this way. And thank you to our
Yeah.
attendees. We'll be sharing the recording of this on our YouTube. But please keep spreading the word and keep engaging with MoAD. We do many virtual and in-person programs and have some wonderful exhibitions. So definitely check us out and support us. And we'll lastly just drop a quick program survey in the chat for you to take a few moments to share feedback about the program and what more you'd like to see from the museum. So thank you all for participating today.
Thank you.
And
Thank you for
we'll see you
coming.
next time.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Take care.